What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Today, we're talking our favorite late round wide receiver steals that are poised for a breakout in this 2020 fantasy football season. Basically, these are going to be the guys that are available after the fourth round. Their rankings are right around the 20th best overall wide receiver and or later, so keep that in mind. And before we get into it, quick reminder for everyone that's interested, the 2020 ADP Fantasy Football Draft Guide is now available for purchase to everyone. For only $10, you get top 150 overall player rankings in standard and PPR formats. You get individual player tiers, rankings, projections, player bios. Also, a more exhaustive list of potential breakouts, busts, and general fantasy advice. Check out the description for all the details and get your copy today. Also, if you guys enjoy, hit that like button, subscribe. But for now, let's get right into it. Kicking things off in order of our favorite wide receivers, we start with Calvin Ridley. And maybe this is cheating a little bit because probably Ridley's ranking is closer to 17th best overall wide receiver, somewhere in that range, not quite the 20 mark, but we have to highlight Ridley nonetheless because we see major potential for him in 2020, and maybe more so than any one of these wide receivers to outperform his projections, because we've said it for a while now, we are absolutely in love with the Atlanta Falcons offense, and with the potential of playing in that high-scoring NFC South 6 times a year, the Falcons are going to be putting up major points. You've got Matt Ryan. You have got a loaded offense. You've got a returning, healthier offensive line. You've got another year of comfort with the offensive coordinator. I anticipate things to click for the Atlanta Falcons, and we kind of saw it last year. Calvin Ridley continues to narrow the gap between himself and Julio Jones, and I continue to think that that will be the case in 2020 as well. I still believe Julio Jones will be the top wide receiver on that offense, but Calvin Ridley, in my opinion, won't be that far behind. The departure of Austin Hooper will also free up some targets. I don't think that Hayden Hurst will automatically inherit all of those, so that should be a bump up for Calvin Ridley as well. Also, another upside for him, he has always had success in the touchdown category, as opposed to maybe his teammate in Julio Jones, who as of recently has struggled in there. But I think he could very well easily get you over 1,000 yards. He was headed for that projection last year up until he got hurt late in the season, and probably good for right around 80 receptions. Right now, I have him much closer in my own personal rankings in both standard and PPR formats to a top 10 wide receiver, as opposed to outside of the top 15 and closer to top 20 where current rankings have him. So for that reason, I am all in on Calvin Ridley in 2020. Continuing on to number 2, we've got Robert Woods of the LA Rams, and even though it's a situation somewhat similar to Calvin Ridley, as his current ranking is probably closer to 18th, 19th overall wide receiver, we have to highlight him nonetheless because we see major production potential here. Now, a lot of people do have Cooper Kupp ahead of Robert Woods in this Rams offense, including us, but the real question becomes how much do we expect that separation to be at the end of the year? Is it going to be a substantial one, or one that's not all that big? And the more and more we continue to look at these projections and stats from previous years for these two players, we tend to agree with the latter, because our current projections have both these guys finishing with between 80 to 90 receptions in 2020, around 1,100 yards receiving. The true separation point will likely be the touchdowns, which are so variable. So from that perspective, and when you factor in where these guys are currently being drafted, well, Robert Woods could potentially be a very similar version of Cooper Kupp that you can get for a lot cheaper about 2 rounds later, let's say. And on top of this, factor in that the departure of Brandin Cooks will open up a lot of opportunities. We realize that Josh Reynolds will be that next man up, but is he ready to right now inherit all of those opportunities? We tend to believe that a lot of them will go the way of Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp. And also, if you look at the way that the Rams were lining up offensively late last year, while there was a lot of tight end focused packages where Cooper Kupp wasn't on the field all that much or as often as we expected, which allowed a lot of opportunities for Robert Woods. If that continues, his ceiling should be that much higher in 2020. For this reason, we really like Robert Woods this year, especially in PPR formats. And we believe he could be a later round steal around the 4th or 5th round if he is still available. Next at number 3, we've got T.Y. Hilton of the Indianapolis Colts. And this is truly where we get to that post 20th overall wide receiver ranking mark. And this is where you're going to see some guys that have maybe an injury history, question mark, or are on offenses that aren't as reliable. But again, they have major upside, and T.Y. Hilton is definitely in that category. Now let's look at all those pros and that upside first, because this entire Indianapolis offense got a major boost after the addition of Phillip Rivers. Comparing Jacoby Brissett of last year and Phillip Rivers in terms of what they each do for the passing potential of this offense is night and day, because even at an advanced age for Phillip Rivers, he's potentially a lock for 4,000 yards passing again in 2020. And that's a major boost for, again, all of these wide receivers, all of these pass catchers. T.Y. Hilton, speaking of those wide receivers, is by far the most experienced and the most talented wide receiver on this Indianapolis offense. And we believe he will quickly become the top target for Phillip Rivers, which will mean a lot of volume, a lot of opportunities on a week-to-week basis. But let's go ahead and look at the cons here, because there is a major risk, and that is the health of T.Y. Hilton. Can you rely on him on a full 16 games? Because these last couple of years, that has not been the case, and that's what's truly hurt his value looking at his 2020 outlook. Because if you could guarantee that T.Y. Hilton would play a full 16 games, he'd be higher on these rankings. Hell, if he had played a full 16 games these last couple of years, he'd almost surely be a top 15 wide receiver. Talent-wise, he's got wide receiver 1 type of abilities. When we look at T.Y. Hilton, even though there is definite risk because of the injury situation, we think that the upside outweighs that risk. For that reason, he is a risk worth taking. And when you're talking about 5th round wide receivers that have wide receiver 1 upside, we definitely love what T.Y. Hilton brings to the table. Coming in at number 4, we've got Brandin Cooks of the Houston Texans. And this is the single most undervalued wide receiver on our list, because this has the biggest discrepancy in wide receiver rankings compared to current rankings that are out there in our own personal big board, between 10 to 15 spots. And we think that's absolutely ludicrous, because let's look at the situation as it stands for the Houston Texans. After DeAndre Hopkins left, that pretty much left them without their most reliable and best wide receiver by far offensively. So what do they go ahead and do in turn? Well, they go ahead and pay a decent price to add Brandin Cooks to that wide receiver room that before looked like, for the most part, Will Fuller and Kenny Stills, who in their own right aren't all that reliable. I think from day one, Brandin Cooks is the top wide receiver on this offense. He's the most experienced wide receiver by far that the Houston Texans have. He has similar traits that Will Fuller and Kenny Still possess. So right now, I'm absolutely shocked by the fact that so many platforms have Will Fuller substantially higher than Brandin Cooks in terms of 2020 fantasy outlook. Now, let's go ahead and address the elephant in the room, because everyone is going to say, well, injuries are a major concern. Okay, I agree with that. The concussion situation last year was definitely alarming for Brandin Cooks, but if you want to talk injuries, there is no more injury concerned wide receiver room in the NFL than the Houston Texans. So if you're telling me that Will Fuller is that much higher than Brandin Cooks on this offense, I don't understand how you can do that, because the guy has never played a full 16 games in his NFL career. And that's saying something. Kenny Stills, in the same breath, he gets nicked up for between 2 to 3 games every single year. So none of those guys can be fully relied on. And when you take that into the equation, every wide receiver in my eyes on the Houston Texans offense instantaneously is now on the same playing level in terms of injuries and reliability. And with that being the case, Brandin Cooks again emerges as the favorite, because the last couple of years, whether it's been on the Patriots or on the Rams, when healthy, he has put up low-end wide receiver one numbers, and we think he can do it again here in 2020. There is massive upside for Brandin Cooks. Yes, there is health concerns, but again, a situation similar to what we said about T.Y. Hilton, the rewards by far outweigh the risk. And since he's currently being viewed as the wide receiver 2 on this Houston Texans offense, major upside. This guy's being undervalued like crazy. You should view him as the wide receiver 1 on the Houston Texans offense. I would seriously be putting in a lot of stocks on Brandin Cooks in 2020. Next up, we've got DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. And this is another situation where Metcalf is the wide receiver 2 on his offense behind Tyler Lockett, but we just don't think that the separation will be all that much for 2020, because you really saw it last year towards the end of the season. Metcalf came on very strong, became much more involved in that offense, and became more reliable on a week-to-week basis, and we believe that that will carry over into this year, because when you look at it, neither one of these wide receivers get major reception numbers, which is a benefit for them when it comes to standard rankings. So the gap between them there will be even smaller, because yardage wise, we think that both of them will probably be around 1,000 yards, 1,100 yards, nothing too crazy. And the real separation point will likely be the touchdown department, where Metcalf definitely has an advantage as far as red zone targets are concerned. He's that big bodied physical type of wide receiver. Now, sure, Tyler Lockett is more explosive and he has a higher ceiling, because he can go ahead and get you a 50-yard touchdown in the blink of an eye by blowing past coverages. But that also means he has a lower floor from time to time and has issues with consistency. In truth, we believe that that'll be the case for both of these wide receivers in the span of the entire season. But DK Metcalf should continue to close that gap. We like his touchdown upside. We think he will reach that 1,000-yard mark in terms of receiving. And at the end of the day, we don't think the separation will be all that much between him and Tyler Lockett. And speaking of Lockett, he's viewed as a top 15 wide receiver. So we don't think that DK Metcalf should be that far behind. Maybe in part because of his sophomore status, because of his inconsistencies his rookie year, he's not viewed that highly. But we like his breakout potential and the upside he has to transition to a wide receiver 1 on the Seattle offense in 2020. Next up, we've got Terry McLaurin of the Washington Redskins. And McLaurin is a name that you're going to hear a lot in 2020. He is one of these fantasy darlings by a lot of these quote-unquote experts. But we want to go ahead and warn you guys that he is also one of the riskiest, if not riskiest, name on this list. And it's not because we're low on his skill set. No, he showed us last year that he is an absolute baller. It's all about the situation in the Washington offense itself, specifically the quarterback position. Because a lot of people will say, well, Dwayne Haskins showed us late last year that he had improved, that, there's some upside there and that he can carry it on to 2020. Well, slow your roll, because if you compare that improvement in play to what he did when he first got that job, well, there's not really anywhere to go but up. That's how bad he was when he first took over the Redskins quarterback spot. And on top of that, okay, later on in the year he was successful, but it was versus bottom of the barrel defenses, and it was versus teams that really had nothing to play for, so we're not all that impressed by this. In fact, we feel pretty strongly that unless Kyle Allen wins this starting job for the Washington Redskins, well, then Terry McLaurin could very quickly go from one of these hyped up fantasy breakouts in 2020 to one of the biggest disappointments for wide receiver fantasy players. And that's because with Kyle Allen, even though he has his fair share of struggles, we at least know what he brings to the table. Because last year, despite him not being a top end or a top 16 quarterback, even, he was still able to provide a very good year for DJ Moore. And we know that he could be able to do the same for Terry McLaurin if he got the majority of starts for the Redskins. But if that goes to Dwayne Haskins, we just don't know what to expect from him. We think his ceiling is lower than that of Kyle Allen. For that reason, we do like Terry McLaurin's skill set, and he should belong on this list, but you should be aware of the risk. And if Dwayne Haskins, again, gets the majority of the starts for the Redskins, Haskins and McLaurin probably not a match made in heaven in terms of fantasy production. Next up at number 7, we have got Jamison Crowder of the New York Jets. And when it comes to Crowder, look, we realize he's not going to be a wide receiver 1 in fantasy football. Probably best case scenario, you're looking at mid-level wide receiver 2 type of potential, and that's probably in PPR formats. But that's still decent value considering where you can get him in later rounds. Because Crowder looks to be the wide receiver 1 for the New York Jets again. And when you look at Sam Darnold's progression and that offense in general, well, Crowder seems to be the top choice and the guy that he is most comfortable with, because Crowder was absolutely peppered with targets last year, and we believe that for the most part that'll continue in 2020. Robbie Anderson no longer there. Instead, insert Brashad Perriman. And even though Perriman did have success late last year, well, will that necessarily translate to this Jets offense that has question marks of its own, and that Sam Darnold still has a lot of room for growth as far as quarterbacks? So maybe some of that chemistry between him and Perriman won't necessarily be there. For that reason, we believe that Jamison Crowder will be that favorite target more often than not for Sam Darnold. He will definitely be in the running for favorite wide receiver 1 on the New York Jets offense itself. And at the end of the day, he's probably going to get the most receptions on the team. And fantasy-wise, that translates to PPR formats. Like we said, a reliable, mid-level, low-end wide receiver 2 on a week-to-week basis. Sure, there's going to be some inconsistencies from time to time, but more often than not, we think that Crowder will be reliable as that wide receiver 2 or flex play on your starting roster. Next at number 8, we have got Diontae Johnson of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And he's another name that's pretty popular as far as late round wide receiver value is concerned. And when you look at what happened with the Steelers last year, you kind of understand why. Because as disappointing as they were offensively, that was in large part due to injuries. Big Ben lost at the start of the season. Juju Smith pretty much consistently dealing with some type of injury, unavailable. Someone had to emerge as that next wide receiver. And considering what Diontae Johnson was able to do with the guys in Duck Hodges and Rudolph under center for the Steelers, it kind of makes it that much more impressive. And we've seen it before that the Steelers can maintain several fantasy relevant wide receivers on their offense. They've got a great offensive line. They've still got a quarterback that's, reliable in Big Ben Roethlisberger, and he's not afraid to sling it. Whether in the past it was Antonio Brown and Juju Smith or Martavius Bryant or Emmanuel Sanders, those combinations have worked. Now, we will say probably the ceiling for this duo of wide receivers not as high as previous years, because Antonio Brown at that point in time was the best wide receiver in football. You can't say that about Juju Smith-Schuster. So in reality, Diontae Johnson's value is probably more so mid-level wide receiver 2, low-end wide receiver 2 at best. But still, he should be able to earn a starting roster spot on your team for the majority of the season, and he does have that big playability that should give him some big-time weeks in 2020. At number 9, we've got Emmanuel Sanders of the Saints, and a lot of this has to do with the situation that Sanders finds himself in, because We absolutely love the upside of the Saints offense, somewhat similar to what we said about the Atlanta Falcons. In fact, we pretty much love the entire NFC South, all those teams, probably with the exception of the Carolina Panthers, in terms of what they bring to the table for fantasy production on a week-to-week basis. We've known for quite a while that the Saints are one of the highest scoring teams pretty much year in and year out. We don't expect that to change in 2020. With a healthy Drew Brees for the majority of the season, we know he's pretty much good for 4,500 yards, even at his current age. And sure, Michael Thomas is arguably the best wide receiver in football, and he's going to automatically get a lot of those targets, that volume, that yardage, those touchdown opportunities. But the fact remains that the Saints haven't had a legitimate wide receiver 2 opposite Michael Thomas really ever. I mean, are you going to try and say that Ted Ginn was that guy? Emmanuel Sanders is leaps and bounds better than what Ted Ginn brought to the table for the New Orleans Saints. He's actually got reliable pass catching abilities, and even though he has had a high ceiling in PPR formats before, we still think that that'll be maintained to some degree, but it'll also be lessened because Michael Thomas pretty much is the king of the receptions in football. So Emmanuel Sanders to some degree will take a step back there. We know that Jared Cook was kind of that next guy up after Michael Thomas last year, but we do like the upside for Emmanuel Sanders more so than Jared Cook. So Sanders should really benefit from some of the opportunities that he automatically gets just by being in the Saints offense. And this is, again, more so the situation because the Saints are going to support a lot of fantasy relevant players, and Emmanuel Sanders should be one of these guys. In PPR formats, he could turn into a reliable wide receiver 2 or flex play on a week-to-week basis. And finally, coming in at number 10, we've got Alshon Jeffery of the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, depending on the platform you're looking at, Jeffery probably right around the 50th overall wide receiver, maybe even lower than that. And if you dissect what the Eagles did during this offseason, during free agency, during the draft, kind of makes sense because, well, Deshaun Jackson returning from injury, Marquise Goodwin traded for during free agency, Jalen Reagor drafted in the first round of the NFL draft, and we haven't even mentioned the tight ends that garner so much attention from Carson Wentz in Dallas Goedert and Zach Ertz. But the fact remains is that we still think that Alshon Jeffery should be the wide receiver 1 on this offense. And don't get us wrong, there's risk. There's a lot of other mouths to feed. Jeffery has dealt with his own fair share of injuries. But compared to Deshaun Jackson, Jeffery should be more reliable on a game-to-game basis. Compared to Jalen Reagor, he's got more experience as Reagor is coming in as a rookie. Compared to Marquise Goodwin, Jeffery knows this Philadelphia offense a lot better. He's got more chemistry with Carson Wentz. All those things combined, and the fact that he might go undrafted depending on your league size and your scoring format, we really like the upside for Alshon Jeffery to surprise a lot of people in 2020. So with that, we wrap up our look into this list of top late round wide receiver fantasy breakouts. And as always, let us hear it in the comment section. Did you agree, disagree, why or why not? And maybe there were some names left off this list. Let us hear your top guys in this category, along with any other questions you guys might have. And like we mentioned before, also check out the 2020 ADP Fantasy Football Draft Guide if you haven't already. It will be a great resource for you as you prep for the upcoming fantasy draft. Many more of these type of deep dives and breakdowns, rankings included in there. All the details in the description. And if you guys enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe. But for now, we will see you guys in future videos.